So the governor comes out yesterday, and Aaron just said, Jay had a bad day yesterday. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the governor comes out, talks for about 2 or 3 minutes, then Jay's got to stand there for 2 or 3 hours and answer all the questions.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. That's what a commissioner of administration is supposed to do. And it was an interesting day yesterday. It's a tough situation we're in. This is not a pretty budget. It's not the one we'd like to have. It's got a lot of devastating cuts in it, and we really have no other choice at this point because we have a $750 million shortfall, despite the money that was raised in the special session.
Jay, you're a pretty honorable guy. You've served in government a long time. There are some that say, threats to tops, it's just that. It's just threats that we're really going to find the money. How do you feel about that?
Just go ahead and tell you, we had John Kennedy on earlier this morning. He said the threat to cut tops is a scare tactic.
Well, it's clearly not a scare tactic. John's running for office and making all kind of easy statements like that, and this is not a scare tactic. And if you look at the budget, it's carefully crafted. We didn't simply go in and cut across the board and say everybody's got to reduce some, hurting good and hurting bad. We tried to be as selective as we could, and there's no good answer when you have a $750 million shortfall. Nobody seems to be disputing the fact that we're $750 million short. And when you have high-dollar projects like TOPS, like our hospitals, DHH, like the minimum foundation formula for K-12 education, they soak up a lot of the state's budget automatically. And TOPS is a $300 million program, and TOPS is a great program. We want to see it continue, but we simply don't have the resources to fund it at its full level. Had we funded TOPS at its full level and cut higher education 25, 30, 40%, or closed all the hospitals, people would be saying that's a scare tactic, and just difficult choices that had to be made, and we just simply do not have the money to fund TOPS fully when we're cutting higher education in a significant way as well.
There's a lot of us, Jay, that have been watching state government for years, and I just look at your division of administration. There's a bunch of offices under yours, and we're talking, I don't know how many state agencies. Couldn't we cut out, say, certain, let's just say media and PR people alone? Just cut 2 from every department. That's a huge chunk of money. And if we go and do that doesn't impact the average citizen. That's what I'm getting at. Aren't there other things we could do that don't impact kids that are going to college and hospitals?
Well, we've cut a lot that don't impact children in hospitals directly. Just for example, in specific response to what you're saying, if we cut 2 people that handle the press in the division, we'd cut everybody I've got handling the press. We have 2 people for the entire division that do our press work and our media work, and they do legitimate work. There are legitimate inquiries that come in that people want to hear answers from. But we've cut this budget dramatically since Governor Edwards took office. I mean, there have been hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts, and there are serious reductions in the budget for every one of these state agencies because of the cuts that they're being required to take, everywhere from 30% or almost 30% cuts in some areas down to single-digit cuts in areas where we just feel like their budgets are so small or such important functions. Like, for example, just picking one, the public defender's office. Statewide public defender is under a huge amount of scrutiny right now, potentially shutting down courts in some systems. We decided we had to fully fund that public defender's office. It's not a big chunk of the budget, but we decided, looking carefully at that as an example, that we shouldn't reduce that anymore.
Mr. Jay, the point has been made by some of the critics that in state government, 22% of managers are managing one person. Is that legit, or is that
we're making that same? I'm making that same inquiry of civil service. That's a question that the Civil Service Commission has to answer because, as you know, the vast majority of employees in state government are civil service employees, meaning that they can't be fired arbitrarily by politicians who come into office. They have a level of protection, and that dates back decades, and it's an appropriate law in Louisiana, and we're asking the Civil Service Commission to look at that. I don't know that there's exactly that 22-1 or whatever ratio has been cited, but we're certainly scrutinizing that because it ought to be smaller, and we're going to work to make it smaller and not simply have people managing one or 2 people in order to get to make more money.
And that's
governed by civil service.
The other thing we hear about over and over again is state contracts, right?
Yeah, we hear a lot about that, and it's a subject that we need to talk about. And Governor Edwards came into office and within the first 2 weeks issued an executive order requiring all of the departments to quantify their contracts and to eliminate or reduce contracts that they felt could be reduced under the budget cuts that were being imposed. And as we talked about the budget yesterday, there were a number of reductions and eliminations of contracts, and we are working on that and believe it to be a problem. It's not the be-all and end-all, though, that will solve our problems. And a lot of the big-ticket items in government are handled by contracts because we simply don't want to grow government by having more state employees handle certain functions. For example, the prescription drug program for every state employee is one of the biggest contracts in the state that is RFP'd and bid out, and that doesn't involve state employees handling that. That's just one example. So we've got to reduce the number of contracts, but we also have to recognize that we can't simply say that that's the solution to our problem, because it's not.
The SNAP fraud here in our area cost our state millions. What can we do about things like that? Because we have Medicaid fraud going on that if we got to the bottom of that, we probably solve our budget problem.
Well, I don't think we solve our budget problem, but it's always going to be a problem. You're always going to have fraud, unfortunately, in any kind of program, and we have it to some extent in Medicaid when we're working to find out exactly how much. I mean, this administration has been on the job for 90 days, and obviously we stepped into a crisis that we didn't create that was a result of 8 years of literally mismanagement and improper budgeting practices where we were spending one-time money on recurring expenses. We had $800 million in the current year's state budget in one-time money. That's awfully consistent with the $750 million shortfall we're facing right now. So we're going to be looking at all these items and everything we can do to make government more efficient and more effective. And that's one of the jobs I have as Commissioner of Administration, and we've already begun that process, and we're going to be continuing it.
So, Mr. Jay, the second special session that the governor's going to ask for, bluntly put, what's he want?
Well, we're going to need $750 million to do everything we need to do to keep our hospitals open.
But obviously, pardon me, you're going in with some kind of plan, right?
Well, there will be. In fact, the governor yesterday asked this task force that had been legislatively created during the special session that is designed for the purpose of looking at the overall structure of government and the structure of our tax base, and to make recommendations by September 1st on what we can do to fix long-term the structural problem we have in the state's taxing scheme.
Pardon me, let's be a little more specific. Gas tax?
No, well, let me finish what I'm telling you.
Okay.
That he asked yesterday that task force to make a report within the next 30 days to the legislature to look at revenue measures that would be appropriate and consistent with where we think we're going to wind up going long term with this structural recommendation. The gas tax has not been on the table for this reason. It is constitutionally dedicated. Any money that's raised from taxing motor vehicles must go to roads and highways and bridges, as it should. And if a gas tax were passed, it would not solve our general fund budget problem. That's why we haven't gotten into the gas tax issue yet.
The purpose of the special session is to come up with new taxes, new revenue sources. What in the governor's mind, are those priorities?
I think you're going to see a lot of discussion about business taxes and about the number of exemptions and exclusions that are provided right now to businesses. One study shows that the top 200 businesses in Louisiana do not pay any income tax. And we know this. Our corporate income tax collections right now are in the negative. In other words, we'd be better off if we didn't have a corporate income tax, because we're paying out more in credits and refunds to businesses than we are collecting revenue. That's completely inconsistent with what tax policy ought to be. And that's the one area that we really haven't gotten into as we should. And I think you're going to see that as a major topic of discussion going forward in the special session.
And yet, pardon me, that if that's the case, what you just said is true. It's not as though businesses from across the country or around the world are flocking to Louisiana. So if you increase the cost of business, won't that hurt the chance of businesses coming here or businesses expanding?
I think what businesses are looking for is some sense of stability in knowing exactly what their tax bill is going to be and exactly what kind of incentives are available to them. We have really over-incentivized in many areas. That's what we're finding as we're scratching and looking beneath the surface, and we've got to try and restructure our tax code. That's at the real crux of this discussion. We have hundreds of millions of dollars in exceptions, exclusions, deductions, and credits. And what our long-term objective is, and this is what the governor had proposed initially, what the Tax Foundation, which is a national, relatively conservative, completely independent body, has looked at Louisiana's tax code and said this is an issue, is to actually reduce corporate and personal income tax rates compress the brackets what determines when you're eligible for what rate, but to actually reduce it and to eliminate a lot of the exemptions and exclusions to make it simpler and better to understand, and therefore I think fairer. And that's really what is going to occupy a lot of our time over the course of the next month or so in looking to what other revenue source may be available if the legislature decides that that's appropriate. Otherwise, they've got to cut the budget $750 million, and if it's not done the way the governor has proposed, and they've got to come up with the moving around of these reductions to make sure we have a balanced budget. The good news is, constitutionally, we have a balanced budget. We can't go into debt as a state, unlike the United States of America.
Governor has told us he would like to lower the personal income tax rates. And
right.
Is that something you really think we can do? I mean, we don't want to pay anymore. None of us want to pay anymore.
Lowering the rates and compressing the brackets would be in coordination with eliminating some of the deductions, both for individuals and corporations, that currently exist. That would make the tax code a lot simpler. In the long term, it would present a situation for growth, actually, with lower rates. But it would be consistent and it would be fair and would be a lot more balanced than it is right now, where individuals are bearing a much bigger load than businesses are when you look at corporate income tax collections.